So for this test setup, we're going to use the local dev system. That is the dev file that's on my local computer. This is a non-network test for the most part. It means the system will be used on a computer with no internet or network sharing needed for most items. On the networked side, we will be using some share features from the local computer where we'll be sharing to the iPad, typically when we're demonstrating how to scan and route jobs. We'll be doing that on the iPad itself while displaying what's happening on the computer screen and recording that. For the client sample, we're going to take 3 parts from the CMMG client. It was stated that parts from that client had failed on test attempts as quote-unquote parts disappeared. For the client setup, we selected 3 parts. We were not given any actual part numbers to test with on what was disappearing. So we've decided to go with 3 based on the complexity of the naming convention of those parts. The first part has a dash in the naming convention with some spaces. The second part uses 2 dashes and a period to denote the 308 caliber. The third part uses 2 dashes and a comma. Our assumption here is that if there's a failure with the CMMG parts, it might be in a naming convention. That's highly questionable. That's what we're going to try to see if we can find out if we use those parts and have some type of failure. For the first part of the testing segment, let's go through actually palletizing the 3 test parts we wanted to set up as a job. So what we do is we go to the customer data, the client list, and we select the client that we want. Over here, we create a new purchase order for this client, and the system will auto-generate a PO number. This is very useful at the time when no purchase order number is given from Profit Key, but we want to continue moving forward with the work. This way, the system has a way to keep the job or jobs tied to a purchase order number specific for that job. The remaining digits in the PO number are serialized, so we're currently using 119. 119 will not repeat in other auto-generated PO numbers. So we'll say OK to select that purchase order number. Now we're going to put in a date of arrival. We can select today's date. Remember, when testing, most of your reports, nearly all the reports, run by date of arrival, or run by the due date rather. And if you pick an earlier date, like let's say I have a list of 100 jobs in the list, and I want to just focus on the one that I'm testing, I might select 6/1 as the date of arrival so that the due date shows up very early. The job number we're going to put in is a series of 1s. You have to put 6 characters in this field or it'll arrow out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to take 6 1s. We're going to say there's 400 parts in this order, and we're going to select one from our list that we talked about earlier, which is this item right here. Now we've added the alternate due date, so you see we have a due date of 10/18 as our due date, and if we wanted to check, is that right? Now this customer has a 7-day turnaround. So if we say the arrival is on the 6th, and we don't count the day that it shows up as per the rules given to us, we say 7-day turnaround and we don't count weekends. 1, 2 work days here. Then we have a weekend and a holiday, so we skip over holiday as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we run into another weekend and we end up on a Monday, which is the 18th. So that would appear to be correct. Now the holiday jump is dependent on what holidays Greystone has put in their list to recognize. So if we didn't recognize Columbus Day as a holiday, we would take it off the list and it wouldn't jump over this holiday. So that's an editable list that we make up for the annual time frame on which holidays we want to recognize. So that looks okay. But let's say that for whatever managerial discretion, they've decided that, you know what, the 18th is not the date, we want to make it the 20th. So we simply put in an alternate date, and that'll alter the viewable due date for everyone. On any reporting, anything anybody sees will look like the due date is the 20th. Conversely, we could say it's also earlier than the due date. What if we don't want the 18th, but we want to say, no, we want to make it a day earlier. We're going to promise it's going to be due on the 17th. We could do that as well. Then we click the status. Status of the job is currently open. Do we want to set this job to be cleared for palletization from profit key? We hit yes, and now the job is ready to be palletized at the cage level. Now, this entire sequence of events originally was designed through the dock receiving setup in the software. So it was originally discussed that there would be somebody at the dock who would receive the products from the client. They would count the number of boxes, the number of pallets, enter the data here for what is on the paperwork to match. That would be cleared by back office, or this job would be done in conjunction with back office. Well, what happened there is that at the cage level, all they're doing is palletizing. They're not doing this whole job setup portion. That was another side of the business, in essence, to be done before it even got to the cage. So the cage may discuss that they have more work to do now than they had before. This is part of that more work area. They have to understand how to take the paperwork, set up the job, and go through that portion of setting up a job. Now, at this point, we want to do 3 parts from this customer. That's part of the test. I can add another job in this section, and we can have all 3 jobs under this purchase order. But what I would like to do for this test is have each part under its own purchase order. Now, you see the client name here. It changes when we hover over it, because I can simply go back to that client by clicking that button. That's your back button for that section. And now I want to create a new purchase order number. See, now we're at number 120. Hit OK. Date of arrival. Give it a job number from profit key. We're going to say this is a series of 6 twos. And we're going to say there's 500 parts for this one. And as we discussed earlier, we want the 308 caliber part number to use as test. That was a 308 upper. Here it is, right here. Alrighty. So everything looks good. We just hit clear it for palletization. I'm going to go back, set up a new one for the last part. We'll say it has 600. And this one is the lower for the AR-15. With a comma in the name. That's the one there. Clear that for palletization. Okay, so the job is established in the software. We've got all the data that we need to support running the job through the software. And now we go to receiving. We select Palletize, and here are our 3 jobs that are ready to be palletized. So we'll take the first job, and we'll say that there are 40 parts in each box. So what it's doing is giving you the traveler input, data input screen. We've got our barcode, and now for traveler choices, we're going to create a queue because they're all the same box. So we're saying they're all the same travelers with the same parts. So we're going to say that there are 10 boxes, and the system's going to generate all the travelers needed for the 10 jobs. We view the status toolbar, we can see that the system's showing us 10 out of 459 records. So now that this job is done, what I want to do is say that this pallet is complete. So we're ready with this pallet. We're going to go to the next step. So I'm going to start my timer on my phone and see how long this takes. So at this point, we can print the travelers. So I don't want to print all these out. What I want to do is set them from my printer and just make PDF files from my screen of all these travelers. So we're going to call this the first job. The travelers. Replace that because I had one job on my screen, and we're going to do the same thing with the palette marker. PDF, save as a PDF, and that is palette marker, save, and now we have our palette marker, and the system goes back and is ready to go. So that whole event took just under 55 seconds, and I wasn't really, rushing it or anything. I just walked right through it. So what that gives me is a PDF file of all the travelers with this job. So when I go to do the test scanning and working with the travelers, I can just scan it off the screen. I don't have to have it in print. I can actually use the scanner or the iPad and scan this right off the screen. All right, at this point too, they would create the routes for production, but we're not going to do that just yet. We're going to finish the other test jobs, palletizing the test jobs, and then we're going to create the routes for production. So we're going to go back to the other two jobs. So what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to time this without talking about it at all. I'm just going to run right through it. You get the idea of what's needed to palletize. So I'm going to hit the start on my timer. 500, so we'll say there are 25 in each box, which would then give us 20 boxes for our 500. So we'll say there's 20 boxes. So double the amount of boxes that were in the first sample that we palletized. I'm going to say I'm done with this, so this pallet's complete. Stop. That process took 1 minute 14 seconds. So 1 minute 14 seconds to palletize a job when we have known data. We're going to reset the clock and we're going to palletize the third job. So for this one, we're going to do the same thing. We'll say there's 30 parts in each box, which will give us 20 boxes. We're going to say this pallet's complete. Okay, and stop the clock. I'm at 1 minute 3 seconds. It's a little faster than the other one, but relatively the same, 1 minute to 1.5 minutes. Palletize a job of 20 boxes, let's say. Not that big a deal. It doesn't represent that if it had 40, that it would be double the time. That's not how it would work out. If we did a job of 40 boxes, it would still be under 2 minutes. So relatively the same. Now, what we've done is we've created a process in the system where we now have identity for every box that arrived for that purchase order for that job. What we have to do now is actually set them up to go through production. That's to create routes for production. So the routes for production is the electronic systematic way to track the parts and movements through production. The system is not going to know what to do with any of these parts because the recipe has not been applied to the parts. The recipe that it goes through production. So that's what we're going to do at this point. Now what we're going to do is we're going to time and we're going to let the system create the routes for production. This is the part that we split off from being automated when we palletize. It used to be that we would palletize and it would create the routes for production for that job while you were palletizing the job. The cage felt this took a long time. It was slowing them down. So we split it off and we put it under its own button on their main receiving menu so that they could choose when they want to create the routes for production. So we've basically palletized 3 jobs. That's going to create a few hundred records because each part may have 7 steps it goes through, 10 steps, 14 steps, and it goes through all the way through production. And the system is going to create a record for each one of those steps. So as it's moving through, the system knows that this is the step it's at, and this is the step it's supposed to be at. And then as we're tracking parts, that's what it's using to track parts as well. How was each part moved based on the traveler where the parts came in. So I'm going to start the timer, and I'm going to say create routes for production. So if I went into production right now and I try to look at any reports for these jobs, no reports are going to show up because they've only been palletized. All right, and stop. So that was approximately 16 and a half seconds. 16 seconds? 17 seconds. And how many records did it create? Let's go take a look. So if we look at the job lifecycle in Excel form, this is what we see. So there was 1 record in here as a placeholder, so it created 450 records for all these parts. So this particular part on the last job that it did goes through 8 steps in production. So in 16 seconds, it created the 450 records. So what if we had 1,000 records? What if we had 3 times as many? It's still going to be under a minute to create all those records. So not that long of a deal. So let's go back to the beginning and let's take a look at where we're at. So if we look at the position and production report, and what we're going to do instead of choosing a specific due date is just look at all the records because we only have the test records that we put in the system. So you can see we have our 3 jobs, their due dates, the 17th and the 18th. Your quantities on your order, the amount of parts, and everything showing as its first step in its recipe, which is the golf step or blast step. So none of the items have been moved into any respective step. If we go look at our adjustments by coaches, we can select the jobs through their job numbers, through the profit key job numbers. So what this list is showing us is everything that's in the system as a job that's currently active. So no jobs that we have in this test system have been closed out. And since it runs by due date, our jobs will be at the bottom of the screen. So here's our 17th due date and our 18th due date. We click on the job to go look at it, and this is what we see. In the first panel, positions are showing 40 in each box were palletized, total of 10 records, total of 400 parts. Here's all of our receiving travelers, which we've not activated any of these buttons just yet, aside from the reprinting all of the travelers, reprinting a single traveler, or deleting this traveler altogether. Not creating misfires at this point. There's nothing in production from what was received, and there's nothing on trays from what was received. No orphans have been applied to this setup.